So a lot of things are out of kilter this week. I am a day late, and that is because yesterday we up in the Pacific Northwest had a total eclipse. And so I hopped on Amtrak and I took a little trip to Salem, Oregon and sat on the north lawn at Willamette University and saw totality, and it was wonderful. And you may notice that the sound quality today is a little bit off. That's because the MP3 recorder I ordinarily use has gone missing. I tidied my office, which is typically a mistake. I often misplace the thing because it's not very big, and after I spent about 10 minutes, which is more than I can spare this time of year, trying to find it, I just gave up and I'm doing this on my iPad. So sorry if it doesn't sound quite as clear as it ordinarily would. This week I went back to something that I've thought a bunch in the past. When I teach culture in any of the dozen classes I teach it in, my working, simple definition is culture is the pool of shared meaning. Culture is everything that multiple people recognize the meaning of and therefore can use to draw from to craft messages. And what I think is our pools have been cut off by a lot of dry land in between. When I teach intercultural communication, there are naive and ineffective communicators who, when they meet someone from a very different culture, the reaction is to say, well, those other people, their reasoning makes no sense, and their behaviors, their ways make no sense. But someone who's an effective intercultural communicator is motivated to try and to understand that it's not a quick process, not a simple process, and there may be difficulties and hurt feelings along the way that need to be patched up, but to try to get inside their thinking, to learn about their thinking, and not the way you dissect a specimen, but in a mutual relationship of growing respect. Which also entails, for me, as the communicator who is seeking to understand this person from another culture, I have to be willing to give some myself. I have to do some self-disclosure. Ideally, I have to create encounters and settings, really, where it is safe for the other person to study me and learn about me, and when we mutually learn about one another, then often what we can do is both of us reframe how we see reality, even from within our own assumptions. When I learn about someone who's from a part of the world where they're not nearly as affluent and they're not nearly as fixated on possessions, and I find that they have got a whole lot of happiness and their life is simple. That's an experience that I had years and years ago on a short-term mission trip, one-week mission trip to Mexico that I think I've talked about before, and I have been on kind of a tear since then of simplifying my life. If, on the other hand, I proceed like the naive and ineffective intercultural communicator, and when people's reasoning makes no sense, when their decisions make no sense, I let that make me angry, then I am failing at my profession. I am doing something. There's something that I teach other people to do, and I try to walk them through how to do it well, lovingly, and in a way that glorifies our Creator, and I do it in a way that is sloppy, impatient, and inept. I came back yet again this week, and this lesson is just hovering over me, and it's taking a long time to take root. I get it for moments, but I don't seem to have any stamina with it. To Jesus' parable about the Pharisee and the tax collector, and the moment where the Pharisee says, "Thank God I am not like these sinners, especially that tax collector over there." I still am having moments when I get angry and the anger very quickly spirals out of control, and I have all these words to frame people whose politics diverge from mine, and those words are hateful, and those words are deeply, deeply insulting. And the lesson that's hovering over me, and I'm taking a very long time developing the discipline to actually do this and to do this with all of my heart. If they are that awful, love them in that precise measure. If they are that filthy and loathsome and incorrigible and useless, if they are all those things, love them exactly that much. Because when God looks at you and the mess you've made of your own life, apart from what Jesus did for you, when God looks at you and sees just you, if such a thing were to happen, you're far worse to him than Donald Trump or the worst of the Trump supporters is to you. Every time I have these moments of being repelled by Donald Trump or by a Trump supporter, I should feel grateful to them. I should feel thankful to them that the lens is being turned around and I am getting a mild, watered down, attenuated view of the effect I have on God with my brokenness and my sinfulness. That's what I thought of for most of the week. Something that hit me, honestly, just this morning. I got to thinking about selection. Selection is something that happens in journalism, and it's something really that happens in all communication and even all perception. But let me talk about journalism first. A few years ago, I did a conference paper on journalism. What does it take to be a journalist? And there are a number of historians of the field of journalism who say they don't like to call it a profession because they say that, honestly, citizen journalists, amateur journalists, make some of the best. That journalism, honestly, is a gift. And what you should be able to do is to sit through a 6-hour zoning board meeting where it felt most of the time like nothing was going on, and you should be able to write a paragraph that distills it down to what is essential and why it matters. And if you can do that, then you are a journalist. If you can take events that may be very time-intensive, but you can extract from them what people need to know, then you are a journalist. But that act right there, extraction, selection, pulling out of a very lengthy, possibly very nuanced, very detailed event, that is what I have been kind of chewing over, ruminating about. Oh my heavens. Forgive me for my distraction, but someone just bicycled past my office window wearing an Iron Man mask. And Pacific Northwest, I'm telling you. So that's something not just journalists do, that's something we do every time we communicate. Every time you give something a name, you name it that and you overlook other aspects of it. And it's really something that goes on in all of perception. I have this lesson that I teach in my interpersonal communication class, to go back to naming for a second, where I tell them that language is a scalpel. That language cuts reality by playing up some features and downplaying other features. Some of the wiser, more flexible thinkers about music that I've known over the years have pointed out, I don't know where this idea originates or who I'm supposed to credit, but that music is not necessarily the beautiful sound you hear, but it's also the silences in between, and it's also the frequencies that weren't played. And really, that's true of all perception. One of the parts of the perception process is selection. You walk into a crowded room and you notice one person and you pay attention to that person. That narrow focus, that's something that all of us do in interacting with our environment. It certainly is possible to have broad focus. It's something I do occasionally with my listening class. We practice having broad focus, and I'll show them complicated pictures, Where's Waldo type pictures, and I'll say, do your best as a mental exercise not to look at anything. Try to take all of it in, as though I'm going to black this out in a few seconds, and sometimes I actually do this, and I want you to tell me as many details as possible, not few, many. So it's possible to have broad focus, but it's not what we typically do. What we tend to do is we tend to select. So journalists select, language selects, perception selects. And what I've talked about over the past couple of weeks, the way food manufacturers have taken salt, sugar, and fat, and they've played it up, and they've pulled it out of its context, and the way pornographers have taken certain body parts, certain behaviors that trigger arousal, and they've pulled them completely out of their context and concentrated them. And I've just been thinking more and more and more about how In 2017, journalism does this, but really I start to think that structurally this is what the internet does. The internet is a fire hose of information, and it is endlessly customizable, and you can tweak, you can adjust the mix to where you keep getting, to where you're filtering, you're getting the kind of details that trigger in you the response that you want to reinforce. So if you're sure that the world is a scary place, then you can pick the news outlets, you can pick the kinds of stories that make you feel more scared, and those confirm the way you'd already made up your mind to view the world. Speaking of scared, one thing that I teach in my conflict class is that very often the emotion you present is not the emotion underneath, that it is a reinterpretation of your feelings. A lot of times it's based on gender, but it can be based on other norms as well. So, I'm sure I've talked about this before, but men very often will present as very angry in the middle of conflict. But if you can talk to them, if you can be ingenious enough to talk to them in a way that they can feel safe and genuinely examine what's going on, they will admit that really what they feel is afraid. But if you're a man, you can't show that you're afraid, so instead you show anger. Women, some women are known, and this is less true than in the past because these gender norms are changing, but for a very long time, women in the middle of conflict might begin to cry. And crying is very often a response to being overloaded with sensation, and if men weren't socialized so young and so firmly not to cry, they'd probably do it too. But women don't get that tight socialization against crying, or did not back when gender norms in the United States were more differentiated. So women would cry in the middle of conflict, and you would think that they were hurt, they were sad, only to find out, oh no, they're furious. So the presenting emotion is often a visible layer over the deeper emotion. And I bring this up again because I've been having these eruptions of anger at people who support Donald Trump. Donald Trump makes a lot of decisions that I find just indefensible, just completely outrageous. This is the opposite of what we need. And he keeps, to my mind, to my perception, breaking promises, going back on things that were fundamental, that were essential to his appeal. And people who voted for him in the first place, they continue to say, nope, this is not a deal breaker, and I get angry all over again. But I think that's probably not anger. I think I'm only noticing the top-level interpretation of it. I think I'm framing it as angry because I don't want to admit that all of this makes me feel afraid. So then, I get to thinking that there is academics, I have this joke with my students all the time, academics absolutely love to make 2x2 tables, where the x-axis represents something, the y-axis represents something, and then you have 4 quadrants. And I got to thinking this morning about the relationship between orientation and disorientation, and the relationship between endangerment and safety. So orientation versus disorientation would be you're oriented when you think you have a very detailed view and you think your information is very accurate. You're disoriented when you feel like you don't know what's going on. And then safety versus endangerment is pretty self-explanatory. And so I started toying around in my mind with the idea that sometimes when you observe something out of its context, that's what makes it scariest. And when context is added, that is a way to feel safer. That's a way to add nuance. So you see a spider, and your almost visceral reaction is to jump back, that that's scary. But then when someone explains to you, the spider's more scared of you than you are, and more than you are of it. Most spiders are completely harmless to people. Spiders are very useful because they kill insects that can spread disease. You put all of that in context and it's not really as scary, and then you can sit still and watch spiders and they're kind of wonderfully fascinating. The same thing with a lot of people who make a lot of decisions that seem very threatening. So you can be very, very scared of people who live on the streets and take drugs, and then you can find out a lot more about their story. And you can feel a lot of empathy for them and realize that if a few things in your life had gone differently, that might be you. And filling in more details and not having a stark little cartoon characterization can take some of the fear off it. So, thinking about being oriented, but also feeling endangered. I have lots and lots of information, and I collect more and more information to fuel my feeling of being endangered and have a clearer and clearer picture of what endangers me that I may loathe it more fully. But it seems as though the kind of information we get is not information that fills in context. We don't want context. Or I don't know, maybe that's not the case, because the whole phenomenon of fake news, maybe it's the false context, but it's the false context that confirms where we have positioned ourselves, that reinforces our public commitments, that lodges us more and more firmly in what Brendan Nyhan calls the backfire effect. And we are decoupled from information that would challenge us, information that has greater fidelity, that an outside observer would recognize as more reliable. I don't know, I'm starting to wander off into the same old idea that we resist information that rationally we should accept is a test of what we believe. We resist the idea that testing is even necessary. Testing feels threatening. One of the interesting things is I think that this whole phenomenon about stripping of context, I go back and forth about whether I think context stripping is something that people are doing deliberately because it's a good marketing move and it makes their messages more likely to earn them wealth or power. Or is it structural? Is it structural? Is it just the way the internet works? Is it just the way we consume media in this generation, and we have not recognized the dangers of it, and we have not yet domesticated it, and we haven't figured out how to make little changes to where some of the costs aren't as severe? And the funny thing is, I think when I go back and forth between it's someone's deliberate agenda, and on the other hand, no, it's just structural, that's me going back and forth between feeling endangered and feeling safe. So those are very preliminary thoughts. Sometimes I think we feel endangered and we feel disoriented at the same time, and that may be the worst kind of anxiety of all. Sometimes I think we feel disoriented, but not endangered. The mental picture I get with that is of if you have children, your children might play really silly games and they make no sense to you and you think, I don't know what they're doing, but honestly I don't need to know and I'm probably better off not knowing. So that's disoriented and safe. And then there is safe and oriented. This is something that I know and I delight to know more about it, so you can find on the internet, you can find live cams of puppies frolicking, and I will watch them endlessly, and I'll notice more and more things about them, and I become more and more oriented, but I don't feel the slightest bit endangered by puppies frolicking together. But it's that difference between endangered and disoriented and endangered and oriented that it feels as though there is something there, that if I continue to come back to that, one of these days the light bulb is going to go on and I'm going to understand something important. Maybe.